Okay, just reminding the group, we have a slightly shorter day than we had yesterday, but not by much, and really a very packed agenda with a lot of science today. So we'll be hearing not only a keynote from Dr. Swaminathan, but also plans for the COVID research, sort of building on our session that we had yesterday, and then a number of scientific presentations that are related to the various, the three teams that we already have assembled, and then a summary and next steps. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Soumya Swaminathan, who is WHO's chief scientist and was most recently their deputy director general for programs. She's a pediatrician trained in India, the United Kingdom, the United States, and is a globally recognized researcher on tuberculosis and HIV. Dr. Swaminathan, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Terry. And good morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone. It's a pleasure to join you for this virtual summit. What I thought I would do, I think I have about 15 minutes, is to perhaps say a little bit about the work of WHO in the past and a little bit about what we think about genomics research globally, and then perhaps spend a few minutes talking about the research roadmap that we developed for COVID research. So, in 2002, WHO had published a book called Genomics and World Health. This was a report that was put together by David Weatherall and a group of scientists on behalf of the WHO's Advisory Committee on Health Research. It was a very forward-looking book, and it had many chapters that really talked about the importance of genomics for world health. And this was quite prescient considering that it was way back in 2002. It foresaw that there was massive potential for human genomics health and the applications that would be coming up in terms of genetic technologies. And it did raise issues that are still pertinent about the implications of justice and resource allocation questions in what was then called the post-genomic era. It also discussed at length the ethical issues in genetic research, screening, and testing, with a particular focus on developing countries. And of course, the world has changed in many ways since then. A lot of capacity has been built in low and middle income settings. There is greater access to vaccines and medicines and so on. But we do see a gradient in the application of human genomic technologies, and that it's still in its infancy in many developing countries. And even common diseases like sickle cell anemia in sub-Saharan Africa, the majority of children still don't get a diagnosis early enough. On the pathogen genomic side, I think there have been huge advances. And we see today that even in a country like the DRC, you can do sequencing out in the field. What I think the point that I'm trying to make is that genetic technologies can achieve their true potential only if the data are generated from a representative sampling of the world's population to guide their use. And very often when you see the word global in any kind of a consortium or in a movement, you see that it often has a few countries from the global south, like maybe China, India, South Africa, and then most of the other countries in these consortia, are more high-income countries. And so what is it going to take for us, to really see a step change in global access to genomic technologies? And perhaps I would like to mention 3 key points here. The first one is that global must mean global. And we should not rest until we have true representation of research from every sub-region of the world, whether it's Central Africa, West Africa, East Africa, not just Southern Africa when we talk about Africa. And we know 50% of the world's population lives in Asia. So you need large global cohorts. If you talk about global cohorts, then you must have a significant representation from Asia and of course from different parts of Africa. Otherwise, it cannot be said to be representative. And I understand all the challenges, that are inherent in this. But I think that's a goal. That's the goal that we should be aiming for. We truly want to be a global network. The other important aspect is governance and regulatory frameworks that work in low middle income countries that can ensure that genomic technologies actually become a reality. WHO has been working on ethical frameworks on genome editing and also on the ethics of artificial intelligence. And we're very much looking at it from the lens of low and middle income countries where these technologies still may not exist, but when they do appear over there, the authorities are going to have to grapple with many ethical, legal, social implications and aspects for which they need to be prepared. Similarly, we hear about the wonderful initiatives by the NIH, the Gates Foundation, etc., on trying to develop low-cost and affordable genetic tools for the cure of sickle cell disease and HIV, a program that was launched late last year. And this necessarily must be applicable in the countries in Africa and Asia where these diseases are endemic. So the second point really is governance, regulatory frameworks, and thinking about that right from the beginning. The third point is that data sharing has to be a two-way street. And traditionally, the researchers from the South are a bit wary sometimes of sharing their data because they feel that they're going to lose their any kind of control that they have over it, and that they sometimes are a co-author in the papers that come out of it, but don't always get full credit. And this is a historical problem that we need to address. And so we need to not only develop the norms and standards and the governance for data management in low and middle income countries, but also develop federated models, which I know that IHCC is doing, for data hosting, sharing, and reuse, so that data sets are truly global and that researchers from the South are driving the research as much as researchers from the North. We also know that innovation is happening everywhere and that local scientists are actually best placed to drive innovation which addresses the needs of local populations because they're closest to the needs. And then finally, we need to accept that innovation is nothing without access. And therefore, affordability, scalability, and equitable access strategies are essential elements not only of the delivery, but also of the R&D space. And the WHO experience has been that if we don't engage in the R&D during the elements of the R&D stage, then sometimes you can lose decades in advancing access to technologies which become available in the high-income countries, and then it takes a long time to translate that. But by engaging at the very beginning, it makes it much easier. We also know that today the data on genomics, quite a large proportion of it is really coming from people from European ancestry, and also that females are underrepresented. And I think I don't need to underline this point. I think everybody is well aware that machine learning algorithms and so on will work only as well as the representativeness of the underlying data set. So there's huge possibility, obviously, for scientists now to work with regulators and ethicists, public health and policy experts to advance the timelines to application of human genomics in developing countries, and that we need to work with local communities, obviously, to accelerate the timelines to access. I did listen to some of the talks yesterday, very interesting talks on the research that's related to COVID, and that some of the cohorts, how the cohorts are adapting themselves really to look at COVID, both from the point of view of genomics and again, using data sets which are truly representative obviously will help us to uncover the predispositions or protection that might exist in some populations, increase susceptibility or not. And so I just wanted to mention that the WHO brought together a large number of scientists and researchers at the beginning of February in what we called the Research and Innovation Forum to really start thinking about what would be the research priorities and a research roadmap for this new virus. And we came up with nine work streams, each of whom have been led by co-chairs from different parts of the world, somebody from WHO, different departments really facilitating their work. And these 9 groups are the first one really looking at the animal-human interface, the origins of the virus, how it spilled over, what's modalities of transmission and the risk factors due to animal trade. A second group that looks at clinical disease and looking at pathophysiology, clinical prognosis, and also these groups meet every week virtually and they discuss different topics. There's clinicians from all over the world, so they share their experiences and they talk about emerging questions that they're getting from their clinical experience that are worth studies being done. For example, the use of steroids or the use or not use of ventilation, for example, the different variations of ARDS that are being observed, the different types of hypoxia. So they discuss all of this and come up with ideas, but they also then come up with ideas of how to share data and information. So for example, we know there are a number of clinical trials going on for corticosteroids. Many of them are going to be small studies. Of course, some of them are looking at different subpopulations, but the idea came that it might be worth sharing those clinical trial data sets in a platform that could be hosted by WHO or by partners, and then have a central data monitoring committee that could then pool all this data and do sort of individual patient meta-analysis. So interesting ideas coming from the clinical research group. Then we have a group that looks at infection prevention and control. So it's more about PPE, the effectiveness of different kinds of public health measures and strategies, physical distancing, school lockdowns, the use of masks, etc. They've been discussing these and then doing systematic reviews. And then, of course, we come up with the technical guidance based on that. They've also been then 3 groups, one looking at diagnostics, one at therapeutics, and one on vaccines. The focus of the therapeutics group was essentially initially to focus on repurposed drugs, which could be tested in RCTs. And so that led to the creation of what we call the Solidarity Trial, which is a 5-arm, multi-country, large randomized trial with an adaptive design, so you can add more arms to it as you go along. And this is currently enrolling in about 20 countries, but there are almost 100 countries that are interested to take part in this trial. And we hope that over the next few weeks, we'll enroll enough. It doesn't have a fixed sample size. It's more of a rolling kind of a trial. The next set of drugs that need to be looked at are, so the committees, once the Solidarity Trial got going with existing repurposed drugs, looking ahead to see what's coming down, monoclonal antibodies, etc., and how those might be fed into this pipeline for testing. On the vaccine side, we've been working very intensively, again, with groups of scientists from all over the world on developing, standardizing animal models, standardizing assays, which would be used in vaccine studies, looking at the ethics of human challenge models, and also developing target product profiles for COVID vaccine, as well as a criteria for prioritization, because as you know, there are over 100 vaccine candidates, probably about 75 to 80 in active development. it would be impossible to take them all through phase 3 trials. So you would need some criteria based on which globally you could prioritize a set of vaccine candidates that need further investment, testing, and of course, then manufacturing and scale up. We're happy that the European Union and many partners yesterday launched this big call for investment into R&D for vaccine therapeutics and diagnostics, and have raised about $8 billion, which is great and will go a long way in developing, but we know it's going to take much more than that to actually procure and supply vaccines and therapeutics for the populations around the world that need it. So access principles and how are we going to actually achieve equitable access in this situation are very, very important. And so there's also a group that looks at social and behavioral science and a group that looks at ethics. These are cross-cutting groups, so they interact with the other research groups. And everyone gets together every few weeks to exchange ideas and update each other, really. But we are thinking that it may be time now to have the big global convening again that we had in February to feedback what the changes have been, achievements, etc. On the capacity building side, WHO has always had several research groups that focus on capacity building, like TDR and HRP. So they help us with that. And also recently there was a very nice thing which happened, which is this coalition of researchers that sort of, it's a loose coalition. So people just decided to form a coalition to actually support researchers in low income countries for COVID research. And you have, I think, the Wellcome Trust, EDCTP, DNDi, and many other organizations actually who formed this coalition and said that they wanted to support research which addressed many of the questions that are in the WHO research roadmap. So I think I can probably stop there, Terry, if that's okay. And if there are some questions or comments, I'm very happy to take those.
Super. Well, thank you very much, Soumya. We've lost your video. Is that a bandwidth problem, or did it somehow get turned off?
Okay, I think it got turned off accidentally.
Oh, okay, great. No, it's good to see you. So I would be eager to see questions from the group in the chat. While that's happening, perhaps I might ask one, which was, you spoke very appropriately about the challenges in making truly global collaborations. We have the same problem, I think, that many others do. And you spoke a little bit about building capacity, but can you give us some advice on how best to really try to engage groups that have not been able to participate in groups like this, and especially what the WHO is doing to try to help facilitate that?
Yeah, I think that's really important. When I meet people from different countries, they always say, they're so keen to take part in research. They have the correct ideas and questions because they're very often clinicians who are dealing with these problems on a day-to-day basis, and yet they feel that they're sort of left out. Mm-hmm. So I don't think there's any best way, but I think perhaps now that we're all virtually connected, it's easier to connect more people rather than bringing everyone physically to one place. And so I think, need to do an active outreach. What we do is we have networks that, as I was mentioning, are research entities within WHO, the Tropical Disease Research, the Special Program for Research and Training on Tropical Diseases, and the Special Program for Human Reproductive Research. And then we have a third entity called the Alliance for Health Policy and Systems. They have centers which are designated centers of excellence in different parts of the world. And then they use them to reach out to local researchers, investigators, with a focus on younger investigators. We also have a network of collaborating centers. So WHO has about 800 collaborating centers around the world. And they work very closely with our technical teams or technical units in actually contributing to the technical work and the mandates of each of our departments. And then, of course, we work through networks of experts. The WHO works through expert groups anyway, so we involve a lot of people. But I think this coalition is an interesting idea that's just been launched. It was announced in the Lancet a few weeks ago, and it would be interesting to see how they are going to work. Now, within Africa, of course, you have the African Academy of Science and the AISA partnership that's very active, and they've put out a call I saw recently for research on COVID. You also have the EDCTP network of clinical trial sites. And so those are some. NIH has, of course, their own sites also that they fund in different parts of the world for mostly through the HIV prevention and vaccine trial networks. But I think what's perhaps neglected perhaps more is on the social and behavioral side. We have also a network called GOAN, which is the Outbreak and Emergency Response Network, and they have members from all over the world as well, but they're more focused really on the outbreak response. So I don't know if there's a good answer, but I think this is something that we should think about. There are enough groups, certainly we know, and enough interested people in Africa and in Asia that would love to get connected to more global networks. It's a question of outreach and ensuring that they're included in some of these conversations.
Great. Well, we could really use your help when you have a moment to try to connect us with those groups. That would be fantastic. I think to try to work them
Absolutely.
into the collaboration. We do need to head into the COVID session, so I'd like to thank you very much for your time. I hope you can join us for parts of the meeting today, and we'll go on now to Kelly and Carrie. So thank you very much.
Thanks.